The dust cloud billowed across the horizon as the stagecoach rumbled away, leaving Molly Aldridge standing alone on the sun-baked road, her single trunk beside her like a silent companion in misfortune. She watched in stunned disbelief as the Wells Fargo stage disappeared into the shimmer of heat waves rising from the New Mexico Territory wilderness, taking with it her hopes of reaching Santa Fe by nightfall. It was June of 1872, and the merciless southwestern sun bore down upon her slender frame as she stood outside the small trading post that barely qualified as a stop on the stagecoach line. The driver had unceremoniously demanded an additional fare due to what he claimed was excess baggage weight, but Molly knew it was nothing more than highway robbery. When she'd refused to pay, he'd simply dumped her trunk in the dirt, tipped his hat with mock courtesy, and signaled the horses forward. "You'll regret this," she had shouted after the departing coach, her voice cracking with both fury and fear. "I paid fair and square for passage to Santa Fe." Now, as the sound of wooden wheels and hoofbeats faded into the distance, Molly felt the weight of her predicament settling upon her shoulders. The trading post behind her looked all but abandoned, with no sign of activity save for a mangy dog sleeping in the sparse shade of the porch. She was 23 years old, alone, and stranded in a territory known for its lawlessness and danger. Molly smoothed the wrinkles from her travel-worn dress, a practical navy blue garment that had once been fashionable in Philadelphia, but now seemed woefully inadequate for the harsh landscape around her. She'd left behind everything familiar: her teaching position, her small rented room, the comfort of civilized society, all to accept a position as governess for a wealthy merchant's family in Santa Fe. The letter of employment, carefully folded in her reticule, now seemed like a cruel joke. She was contemplating her limited options when the sound of approaching hoofbeats caught her attention. Turning toward the noise, she saw a lone rider emerging from a stand of cottonwoods along the nearby creek bed. The man sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky. As he drew closer, Molly could make out the details of his appearance: the weather-beaten Stetson pulled low over his eyes, the dusty denim and leather of his clothes, and the confident ease with which he handled his chestnut gelding. Instinctively, Molly reached for the small Derringer pistol hidden in her pocket. Her father had insisted she carry it for protection on her journey west, and though she'd never fired it, the cool metal against her palm provided a measure of comfort. The stranger reined his horse to a respectful distance away. He removed his hat, revealing a shock of dark hair and a face bronzed by years under the southwestern sun. His eyes, a piercing blue that seemed at odds with his otherwise rugged appearance, assessed her situation quickly. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice carrying a gentle drawl. "Looks like you might be in some trouble." Molly straightened her spine, unwilling to appear vulnerable despite her circumstances. "The stagecoach left without me," she replied stiffly. "There seems to have been a disagreement about the fare." The man's mouth twitched slightly at the corners, hinting at a smile. "Old Hiram's been pulling that trick for years. Charges extra once you're too far from town to turn back." He dismounted with fluid grace, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Jake Newcomb, madam. I ranch about 15 miles north of here." "Molly Aldridge," she responded, relaxing her grip on the hidden pistol but not releasing it entirely. "I was bound for Santa Fe to take a position as a governess." Jake nodded, glancing at her trunk and then up at the sky, where the sun had begun its westward descent. "Santa Fe's a good 3 days' ride from here, and this isn't a place for a lady to be stranded." He gestured toward the dilapidated trading post. "Coyote Station's been all but abandoned since the new stage line changed its route. Not even sure if old Tom's still tending it." As if to confirm his words, the front door of the station creaked open, and an elderly man with a white beard peered out suspiciously before retreating back inside, the door slamming shut behind him. "Charming," Molly muttered. Jake chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to soften the harsh landscape around them. "The nearest proper town is Placitas, about 12 miles east." He paused, studying her thoughtfully. "I know a better destination, Miss Aldridge." I'm heading to Socorro tomorrow. It's a growing town with a regular stage connection to Santa Fe. You'd find it a sight more comfortable than waiting here for the next coach, which might not come for days." Molly hesitated. Everything she'd been taught warned against trusting strangers, particularly in this wild territory where law and order were concepts rather than realities. Yet there was something steady in Jake Newcomb's gaze, something that spoke of reliability and honor. "And where would I stay tonight, Mr. Newcomb?" she asked cautiously. "My sister runs a small boarding house in Placitas," he replied. "She'd be glad for the company. I can take you there now and we can set out for Socorro after you've had a proper night's rest." Molly weighed her options quickly. The abandoned trading post offered little safety, and the prospect of waiting days for another stagecoach seemed increasingly foolish. The Derringer would remain in her pocket and she'd keep her wits about her. "Very well, Mr. Newcomb," she said finally. "I accept your kind offer, though I insist on paying for any accommodations and transportation." Jake's face broke into a genuine smile, transforming his rugged features. "Fair enough, Miss Aldridge." He approached her trunk, hefting it with ease. "My horse can carry this well enough." "I hope you don't mind sharing the saddle for the ride to Placitas." The thought of such close proximity to this stranger made Molly's cheeks warm, but practicality won out over propriety. "I suppose I have little choice in the matter." Jake secured her trunk behind his saddle, then helped Molly mount. She settled awkwardly side saddle, grateful for the modest length of her traveling dress. When Jake swung up behind her, she tensed momentarily at the unfamiliar intimacy of their position. "I'll keep a respectful distance as best I can, Miss Aldridge," he said quietly, seeming to sense her discomfort. "Just lean back a little so you don't fall." As they set off toward Placitas, the sun beginning its descent behind the Sandia Mountains, Molly found herself gradually relaxing against the solid warmth of Jake Newcomb's chest. The rhythm of the horse's gait and the vast beauty of the New Mexico landscape worked a strange magic, and for the first time since the stagecoach had abandoned her, she felt a curious sense of possibility rather than disaster. Little did she know that the stagecoach's departure marked not an ending, but a beginning one that would lead her down paths she had never imagined when she'd left Philadelphia behind. The journey to Placitas took longer than the 12 miles suggested, as Jake kept his horse at a steady pace to avoid exhausting the animal with its double burden. As they rode, Molly learned that Jake had come west after the war between the states, seeking a fresh start away from the devastation that had claimed his family's Tennessee farm. "Lost my pa and older brother at Shiloh," he told her, his voice matter of fact but tinged with old sorrow. "Ma held on until 68, but the farm was too much for her and me to manage alone. My sister Sarah married a man who'd prospected some in New Mexico territory. When he wrote about the opportunities here, we sold what was left and came west." "I'm sorry about your family," Molly said softly, understanding loss all too well herself. "My mother died when I was 14. My father raised me alone until consumption took him last winter." Jake was quiet for a moment, and she felt the slight tightening of his arm where it brushed against her waist. "Seems we've both seen our share of grief, Miss Aldridge." The sun was setting in earnest when they crested a small rise and Placitas came into view. It was larger than Molly had expected a proper town with several streets, a church steeple, and the warm glow of lamplight visible in windows. Compared to Philadelphia, it was barely a village, but after the desolation of Coyote Station, it looked like civilization itself. "Sarah's place is just on the edge of town," Jake said, directing his horse down a well-worn trail. "It's not fancy, but it's clean and safe." The boarding house was a 2-story adobe structure with a wide porch and neat curtains in the windows. As they approached, the front door opened and a woman stepped out, shading her eyes against the last rays of sunlight. "Jake Newcomb, is that you bringing company at this hour?" she called, her tone a blend of surprise and welcome. "Evening, Sarah," Jake replied, reining his horse to a stop. "This is Miss Molly Aldridge. The stagecoach left her stranded at Coyote Station. She's bound for Santa Fe but needs a place for the night." Sarah Newcomb Henderson was a few years older than her brother, with the same striking blue eyes but softer features. She hurried down the steps as Jake dismounted and turned to help Molly down from the saddle. "Those stage drivers are becoming more rascally by the day," Sarah declared, taking Molly's hand warmly between both of hers. "You poor dear, what an ordeal." "Come inside at once, I've just put supper on the table and there's plenty to share." Jake lifted Molly's trunk from the horse. "I told Miss Aldridge I'd take her to Socorro tomorrow where she can catch a proper stage to Santa Fe." Sarah shot her brother a knowing look that Molly couldn't quite interpret. "That's mighty considerate of you, Jake. Almost makes me think you've got reasons beyond mere gallantry." Jake cleared his throat, hefting the trunk. "Where would you like this, Sarah?" "The blue room upstairs is ready," his sister replied with a small smile. "Then come back down for supper. Miss Aldridge looks like she could use a good meal after her troubles." The interior of the boarding house was modest but immaculately kept, with simple furniture polished to a warm glow and colorful woven rugs softening the plank floors. Sarah's husband Daniel, a quiet man with kind eyes, greeted Molly warmly, while their two children Mary, age 10, and Samuel, age 8, regarded her with undisguised curiosity. After washing away the dust of travel in the small basin Sarah provided, Molly joined the family at the supper table. The meal was simple but delicious: roast chicken, potatoes with gravy, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and a savory vegetable stew that Sarah explained contained green chilies grown locally. "How do you find our New Mexico territory so far, Miss Aldridge?" Daniel asked as he passed her the bread basket. "It's certainly dramatic," Molly replied diplomatically. "The landscapes are unlike anything I've seen before." "It grows on you," Jake said, a smile playing at his lips. "First time I saw these mountains and deserts, I thought I'd landed on the moon. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else." "Jake's ranch is becoming one of the most successful in the county," Sarah said proudly. "He's got the best water rights on Coyote Creek and raises the finest horses this side of the Rio Grande." Molly noticed a slight flush rise on Jake's tan cheeks. "Sarah exaggerates," he said. "The place is modest, but it's coming along." The conversation flowed easily through the meal, and Molly found herself relaxing in the company of these kind strangers. After supper, Sarah shooed the men out onto the porch and enlisted Molly's help with the dishes, clearly eager for female conversation. "So a governess position brings you all the way from Philadelphia?" Sarah asked, handing Molly a dish towel. "That's quite a journey to make alone." "I had few options remaining in Philadelphia," Molly admitted. "The school where I taught closed suddenly when its benefactor withdrew his support. With my father gone and our savings depleted by his medical expenses, I needed to find work quickly." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "The West offers opportunities, though they often come wrapped in hardship. The Ortega family in Santa Fe, are they your employers?" "Yes, Don Francisco Ortega," Molly confirmed. "Do you know them?" "Only by reputation. They're one of the oldest Spanish families in the territory, wealthy landowners with business interests throughout the Southwest." Sarah paused, considering her next words carefully. "They're said to be fair employers, if somewhat traditional in their views. The daughters are reportedly lovely girls who will benefit from your teaching." Something in Sarah's tone made Molly wonder if there was more she wasn't saying, but before she could inquire further, Jake appeared in the doorway. "Daniel's offered to help me look over the wagon before tomorrow's journey," he said. "I'll be by at first light, Miss Aldridge, if that suits." "That would be fine, Mr. Newcomb," Molly replied, suddenly aware that she would be spending the entire day in his company tomorrow. "And thank you again for your assistance today." After Jake departed, Sarah showed Molly to the blue room, a small but comfortable chamber with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street of Placitas. "You'll be safe here," Sarah assured her, lighting the lamp on the bedside table. "Though I should warn you that Jake rises with the sun, so be prepared for an early start." "Mrs. Henderson," Molly began hesitantly, "may I ask you something about the Ortega family?" Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her apron. "What would you like to know? You seemed concerned when we spoke of them earlier. Is there something I should be aware of?" Sarah sighed. "It's not my place to discourage you, especially when you've come so far. The Ortegas are indeed respected, but..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. Don Francisco is known to be very controlling of his household. His wife passed some years ago, and he's raised his daughters according to the old Spanish traditions very sheltered, very strictly. Some say he seeks to keep them from all outside influences that might encourage modern ideas. A chill ran through Molly. Are you suggesting I may not be welcome? I'm sure your contract is valid, Sarah hastened to reassure her. It's just, perhaps consider keeping your options open. New Mexico territory offers many possibilities for an educated woman like yourself. She patted Molly's hand. Sleep well, dear. Tomorrow is another day, and the journey to Socorro will give you time to consider matters. After Sarah left, Molly sat on the bed, her mind whirling with this new information. The secure position she'd counted on suddenly seemed less certain. She took out the letter of employment from her reticule, reading it again by lamplight. The terms were generous, the expectations clearly stated, but now she wondered what remained unwritten between the formal lines of Don Francisco's elegant script. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams filled with stagecoaches that never stopped and doors that remained forever locked. When dawn broke, she rose wearily, washing and dressing with care in her second-best traveling outfit, a sage green dress with modest trim and practical buttons. Jake was true to his word, arriving just as the sun crested the eastern mountains. He had exchanged his trail-worn clothes for a clean shirt and newer denims, and his hair was still damp from washing. The transformation was subtle but noticeable, and Molly found herself strangely pleased by the effort he had made. "Good morning, Miss Aldridge," he greeted her, removing his hat as she descended the stairs. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough, thank you," she replied, not mentioning her restless night. "Is that the wagon for our journey?" Outside, a sturdy farm wagon stood ready, her trunk already loaded in the back along with several crates and canvas-covered bundles. A team of 2 strong bay horses waited patiently in the traces. "It's not as comfortable as a stagecoach," Jake apologized, "but I've padded the seat with blankets and we'll take it slow over the rough patches." Sarah provided them with a hamper of food for the journey: fried chicken, corn bread, apples, and a jug of cool cider, and embraced Molly warmly before they departed. "Remember what I said," she whispered. "Keep your options open." As the wagon rolled out of Placitas heading south, the morning sun bathed the landscape in golden light, transforming the rugged terrain into something almost magical. Jake handled the team with confident ease, maintaining a steady pace as he pointed out landmarks along the way. "That's the Sandia Mountains to the east," he explained. "The Rio Grande flows through the valley beyond them. We'll follow this old Spanish road most of the way to Socorro. It's been a trading route for centuries." Molly found herself captivated not just by the dramatic scenery, but by Jake's evident love for this harsh, beautiful land. He spoke knowledgeably of its history, of the ancient peoples who had built civilizations here long before Europeans arrived, and of the delicate balance of water and life that made survival possible. "How did you learn all this?" she asked, genuinely curious. Jake smiled, the expression transforming his face. "Books, mostly, and listening to the old-timers, both Hispanic and native. A man who doesn't understand the land he lives on is always going to be a stranger to it." They stopped at midday beside a small creek shaded by cottonwood trees. Jake unhitched the horses to let them drink and graze while he spread a blanket in the shade for their meal. As they ate Sarah's excellent provisions, Molly found herself relaxing in his company, the formal Mr. Newcomb and Miss Aldridge gradually giving way to Jake and Molly as the conversation flowed more easily between them. "You mentioned you teach," Jake said as they finished the last of the apple slices. "What subjects?" "Everything, really," Molly replied. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, some natural philosophy. I particularly enjoy literature and poetry." Jake nodded appreciatively. "I've always been fond of reading myself. Not much time for it during the busy seasons, but winter evenings on the ranch are long. I've built up a modest library." The thought of this rugged cowboy reading poetry by lamplight was unexpectedly endearing. "And what do you read, Jake Newcomb?" "History, mostly. Some science when I can understand it." And yes, he added with a self-deprecating smile, even poetry now and then. Wordsworth makes more sense out here than he ever did back east. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity, Molly quoted softly. Jake's eyes widened in surprise and admiration. You know Wordsworth? I told you I enjoy poetry, she reminded him with a smile. Their gazes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Molly felt a curious flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the spicy food or the heat of the day. She looked away first, suddenly aware of how isolated they were in this peaceful spot, how intimate this simple meal had become. We should continue if we want to reach Sakuro by nightfall, she said, rising to her feet and brushing crumbs from her skirts. Jake nodded, packing away the remains of their meal with efficient movements. There's a storm brewing to the west, he observed, nodding toward distant clouds gathering over the mountains. We'd best make good time while we can. As they continued their journey, the easy conversation of the morning gave way to a comfortable silence. Molly found herself stealing glances at Jake's profile, noticing the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkle at the corners of his eyes when he squinted against the sun. He was unlike any man she had known in Philadelphia. There was a directness to him, an absence of pretense that she found refreshing. They were still several miles from Sakuro when the storm Jake had predicted caught up with them. The sky darkened rapidly, and the first fat raindrops began to fall, quickly becoming a downpour that reduced visibility to mere yards. There's an old line shack about a half-mile ahead, Jake shouted over the drumming of rain on the wagon's canvas cover. We can wait out the worst of it there. He urged the horses forward through the deepening mud, the wagon lurching and sliding alarmingly. When a particularly violent gust of wind threatened to overturn them, Jake instinctively threw one arm across Molly to steady her, the unexpected contact sending a jolt of awareness through her that had nothing to do with fear. The line shack proved to be a simple one-room structure with a sagging roof and dirt floor, but it was dry inside and offered shelter from the increasingly violent storm. Jake tended to the horses first, unhitching them and leading them to the lean-to at the side of the shack, before helping Molly down from the wagon. They were both soaked through by the time they reached the door, and Molly's teeth were chattering from the sudden drop in temperature. Inside, Jake quickly built a fire in the small stone hearth while Molly stood shivering, her wet clothes clinging uncomfortably to her skin. You need to get out of those wet things, Jake said practically, keeping his eyes averted. There should be some old blankets in that trunk by the wall. I'll step outside while you change. You're as wet as I am, Molly protested, and the storm's only getting worse. Jake hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. I'll turn my back then, he said finally. There's no sense in both of us catching pneumonia. They arranged an awkward compromise, with Jake facing the wall while Molly quickly removed her sodden dress and petticoats, wrapping herself in a coarse but dry blanket before allowing him to do the same. They hung their wet clothes near the fire to dry, then sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the dancing flames casting shifting shadows on the rough walls. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, rain hammering on the roof and wind howling around the eaves. A sudden crack of thunder made Molly jump, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Sounds like we might be here a while, Jake observed, adding another piece of wood to the fire. These summer storms can blow themselves out quickly, or they can last half the night. Molly nodded, suddenly very aware of their isolation and state of undress. It was a situation that would have been scandalous in Philadelphia society, yet here in this wilderness, the normal rules seemed distant and irrelevant. Tell me about your ranch, she said, partly to distract herself from these unsettling thoughts. Sarah mentioned you raise horses. Jake's face lit up at the question. I started with just 2 mares and a stallion I brought from Tennessee. Now I've got nearly 30 head, including some of the finest breeding stock in the territory. Pride was evident in his voice as he continued. I'm crossing the Tennessee Walker bloodline with local Mustangs getting horses with endurance and a smoother gait, perfect for the long distances out here. It sounds like you've built something remarkable, Molly said, genuinely impressed. You must be very proud. It's been hard work, Jake admitted, and I'm still building. The house is just a 2-room cabin for now, but I've been cutting timber for expansion. Been thinking it's time to make it a proper home. There was something in the way he said, home, that made Molly wonder what or who he envisioned filling those unbuilt rooms. The thought brought an unexpected pang of something that felt strangely like regret. And what about this position in Santa Fe? Jake asked after a moment. Is it what you truly want? The directness of the question caught her off guard. I need employment, she said carefully. Teaching is what I know. That wasn't what I asked, Jake pointed out gently. Molly stared into the flames, considering her answer. I don't know what I want, she admitted finally. When my father died, I had to be practical. The position with the Ortega family offered security, a good wage, and respectable work. What more should I ask for? Perhaps happiness. Jake suggested, purpose, a place where you truly belong. Those are luxuries, Mr. Newcomb, Molly replied, reverting to formality as a defense against the uncomfortable truth in his words. A woman alone in the world must think first of survival. Jake nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I understand survival, Molly. After the war, after losing most of my family, that's all I thought about too. But eventually, a person has to start living for something more than just making it to the next day. The simple wisdom in his words resonated deeply, touching something that Molly had kept carefully buried since her father's death. She had been surviving, not living, moving from one necessary step to the next without allowing herself to consider what she truly desired from life. Outside, the storm continued unabated, rain drumming on the roof and wind rattling the single small window. The fire crackled between them, casting Jake's features into golden relief against the shadows. In that moment, with pretense stripped away by circumstance, Molly saw him clearly, not just the rugged exterior but the thoughtful, honorable man beneath. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly. You could have left me at your sister's boarding house. Sakura is miles out of your way. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers across the flickering firelight. Because from the moment I saw you standing alone at that abandoned station, I couldn't ride away, he said finally. There was something about you, Molly Aldridge, something that made me want to know your story. The honesty in his answer disarmed her. In Philadelphia, men had courted her with practiced compliments and careful strategies. Jake's straightforward admission was refreshing by comparison. And now that you know a little of my story, she asked softly, a smile touched the corners of his mouth. Now I find myself wishing it might somehow intersect with mine. The simple statement hung in the air between them, neither a declaration nor a question, but something in between, a possibility, an opening. Before Molly could formulate a response, a tremendous crash of thunder directly overhead made them both jump, and the ancient roof chose that moment to give way in one corner, sending a cascade of water pouring into the shack. Jake leaped up, blanket clutched around his waist, and quickly moved to salvage their drying clothes from the sudden indoor deluge. Molly joined him, and together they relocated to the dry side of the small space, their earlier moment of connection broken but not forgotten. By the time they managed to rearrange themselves, Molly realized with dismay that while Jake's clothes had largely escaped the downpour, her dress and petticoats were soaked anew. The prospect of traveling onward in wet clothing was distinctly unappealing, especially as the storm showed no signs of abating. We'll have to wait till morning, Jake said, confirming her thoughts. The road to Sakura will be washed out in places after this. Trying to navigate it in the dark would be foolhardy. The practicalities of spending the night in such close quarters, with Molly effectively dressed in nothing but a blanket, created a new tension between them. Jake solved part of the problem by offering her his shirt, which had remained relatively dry. It'll be like a nightshirt on you, he said, politely turning his back while she slipped it on beneath the blanket. Not fancy, but better than nothing. The soft flannel fell to mid-thigh on Molly, and she wrapped the blanket around her waist like a skirt for additional modesty. Jake, now clad only in his denims with the blanket draped over his shoulders, kept a respectful distance as they settled in for the night. The fire had died down to embers, casting the small shack in near darkness. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to diminish, the spaces between thunder growing longer, the rain less torrential. Through the single small window, Molly could see stars appearing as clouds scudded across the night sky. "You should take the bedroll," Jake said, nodding toward the narrow pallet in the corner. "I'll be fine here by the fire." Molly was too exhausted to argue. The events of the day, the long journey, the storm, the confusing new emotions Jake had awakened had drained her completely. She curled up on the rough blankets, watching through half-closed eyes as Jake added a few more sticks to the fire. "Jake," she said softly as sleep began to claim her, "thank you." His smile was the last thing she saw before her eyes drifted closed. "Sleep well, Molly Aldridge." She woke to early morning sunlight streaming through the window and the scent of coffee brewing over a small fire. Jake had already been up for some time, judging by the fact that he was fully dressed and had managed to create a semblance of breakfast from their remaining provisions. "Your clothes are still damp," he said apologetically, handing her a tin cup of strong black coffee. "But the day's warming up quickly. They'll dry faster once we're on the road." Molly sipped the coffee gratefully, using the moment to gather her composure. In the clear light of morning, the intimacy of their shelter seemed both more innocent and more significant than it had in the storm-tossed darkness. She had slept in this man's shirt, had shared this small space with him through the night, had revealed more of herself both physically and emotionally than propriety would ever have allowed. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Jake busied himself with preparations for their departure, giving her privacy to dress as best she could in her still damp clothing. Outside, the world had been transformed by the storm. The air was washed clean, the desert plants already responding to the rare moisture with visible vigor. Jake had repaired the wagon where necessary and readied the horses, his efficiency speaking of years of self-reliance. As they set off toward Socorro, the road indeed showed signs of the previous night's downpour washed out sections, deep puddles, and debris swept down from higher elevations. Jake navigated these hazards with careful skill, occasionally dismounting to clear the path or guide the horses through particularly treacherous stretches. Their conversation was sparse but comfortable, each perhaps reflecting on the unexpected intimacy that had developed between them. When Socorro's church spire finally came into view around midday, Molly felt a curious reluctance rather than relief. Their journey was ending, and with it, perhaps, this brief interlude outside the constraints of normal society. Socorro in 1872 was a growing town, buoyed by nearby mining operations and its position on both the Rio Grande and the main north-south route through the territory. Jake drove directly to the Wells Fargo office, where the station master confirmed that the next stage to Santa Fe would depart the following morning. "I can secure you a place on it," Jake offered as they stood outside the office. "And there's a decent hotel across the street where you can stay tonight." Molly nodded, suddenly uncertain what to say. The practical arrangements were simple enough, but they didn't address the unspoken question that hung between them: what happened next. "I should thank you properly for all your help," she began awkwardly. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along when you did." Jake smiled, though there was a shadow of something like regret in his eyes. "No thanks needed, Molly. It was my pleasure." They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, the bustling street around them a stark contrast to the isolation they'd shared. Finally, Jake cleared his throat. "I have some business to attend to in town, supplies to purchase for the ranch. Would you allow me to escort you to dinner this evening? A proper meal at the hotel dining room as a farewell before you continue your journey." "I would like that," Molly replied, surprised by how much she meant it. Jake nodded, his expression brightening. "I'll call for you at 6 then." After securing her room at the hotel and seeing her trunk safely delivered, Jake tipped his hat and departed to conduct his business. Left alone for the first time in 2 days, Molly found herself at loose ends. The hotel offered a bath, which she gratefully accepted, washing away the dust and memories of the storm. Afterward, she carefully pressed her best remaining dress, a deep blue taffeta with modest lace trim at collar and cuffs. As she dressed for dinner, Molly found her thoughts returning to Sarah Henderson's warning about the Ortega household and Jake's question about what she truly wanted. The position in Santa Fe had represented security and purpose when she had nothing else. But now, having glimpsed another kind of life in this territory, she wondered if she was making the right choice. Jake arrived promptly at 6, freshly shaved and dressed in what were clearly his best clothes, a dark jacket over a clean white shirt, his usual denims replaced by proper trousers. He had even polished his boots to a respectable shine. The effort he'd made touched Molly deeply, suggesting this dinner meant as much to him as it did to her. The hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Socorro, which wasn't saying a great deal by Eastern standards but represented frontier luxury. White tablecloths, proper silverware, and a menu that offered more than the basic trail fare Molly had become accustomed to marked it as special. Their conversation over dinner flowed easily, ranging from their respective childhoods to their dreams for the future. Jake spoke of his plans to expand his horse breeding operation, potentially supplying mounts for the cavalry at nearby Fort Craig. Molly shared stories of her teaching days in Philadelphia, the children she had grown to love, the satisfaction of watching young minds develop and flourish. "You're a natural teacher," Jake observed. "Your face lights up when you talk about it." "I do love it," Molly admitted. "There's nothing quite like seeing a child grasp a difficult concept for the first time." Jake hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "You know, Placitas is growing rapidly. Sarah mentioned just last month that the town council is planning to build a proper schoolhouse. They'll be looking for a qualified teacher." Molly set down her fork, surprised by the suggestion. "Are you saying I should consider staying in Placitas instead of continuing to Santa Fe?" "I'm saying you have options," Jake replied carefully. "The Ortega position may be exactly right for you, but teaching a handful of privileged girls seems a smaller canvas for your talents than shaping the minds of an entire community." The idea took root immediately, resonating with something Molly hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge: her ambition to make a real difference, to build something of her own rather than fitting herself into someone else's household. "It's an interesting thought," she said slowly. "Though I've signed a contract with Don Francisco. Contracts can be renegotiated," Jake pointed out, "especially if you haven't yet begun the position." They lingered over coffee and dessert, the conversation turning to lighter topics as they both perhaps sensed the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. When they finally rose to leave, the dining room had emptied of other patrons, and the hotel staff was discreetly preparing for closing. Jake escorted Molly to the foot of the stairs leading to the hotel's upper floor where her room was located. They paused there, the moment of parting suddenly awkward with everything left unsaid between them. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Molly said formally, though her heart was racing with emotions far from formal. "The pleasure was mine," Jake replied, his blue eyes intent on hers. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "Molly, I know we've known each other only briefly, but I feel the hotel manager chose that moment to approach, politely informing them that he was about to lock the front doors for the night." The interruption broke the moment, and Jake stepped back, the unfinished declaration hanging in the air between them. "I'll see you in the morning," he said instead. "The stage departs at 9, Molly nodded, disappointment and relief mingling confusingly in her chest. "Good night, Jake." In her room, Molly sat at the small writing desk, pen poised over paper as she composed a letter to Don Francisco Ortega. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing certainty as she explained that unforeseen circumstances prevented her from accepting the position as governess to his daughters. She apologized for any inconvenience, recommended a colleague from Philadelphia who might be suitable instead, and offered to return the advance payment she had received. It was nearly midnight when she sealed the envelope, her decision made. She would not continue to Santa Fe tomorrow. Instead, she would return to Placitas with Jake and inquire about the teaching position there. It might mean initial hardship, living at Sarah's boarding house while establishing herself, but the prospect filled her with more excitement than the Ortega position ever had. What remained unclear was Jake's role in this new plan. His hints and half-finished declarations suggested he felt the same connection she did, but Molly was too pragmatic to build her future around a man she had known for mere days, no matter how strong the attraction between them. Morning brought clear skies and the bustle of preparations for the Stagecoach's departure. Molly paid her hotel bill and waited in the lobby, her trunk beside her but her ticket to Santa Fe conspicuously unpurchased. When Jake arrived to escort her to the stage office, his expression showed surprise at finding her still at the hotel. "I was afraid I'd missed you," he said, glancing at the clock that showed 9:15. "I've decided not to go to Santa Fe," Molly replied, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "I've written to Don Francisco declining the position." Hope and confusion warred in Jake's expression. "May I ask why?" "Because you were right," she said simply. "I was thinking only of survival, not of what would truly make me happy. Teaching a whole community of children, helping build something lasting, that's a far better use of my abilities than being sequestered in a wealthy man's home." The smile that broke across Jake's face was like sunrise over the mountains. "So you're coming back to Placida's, if Sarah will have me as a boarder until I can establish myself," Molly confirmed. "And if the town council is truly interested in hiring a teacher." "They'd be fools to turn you down," Jake said with conviction. "And Sarah will be delighted to have you stay as long as needed." There was more he wasn't saying, Molly could tell. A question or declaration hovered unspoken between them, but perhaps he too recognized that some things shouldn't be rushed. "Shall we head back then?" she suggested, rising from her seat. "That is, if you don't mind the company on your return journey." Jake's smile deepened. "I was hoping you'd say that." The return trip to Placida's was filled with a sense of possibility that made the landscape seem even more vibrant than before. Jake pointed out features they had missed on their outward journey: ancient petroglyphs carved into rock faces, the distant peaks of mountains with romantic Spanish names, the subtle signs of wildlife that most travelers overlooked. They stopped for lunch at the same creek where they had rested before, the ground still damp from the recent storm but the day warm and pleasant. As they sat together on the blanket Jake spread beneath a cottonwood tree, Molly felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. "There's something I've been meaning to ask," Jake said as they finished the simple meal he had packed. "Last night at the hotel, before we were interrupted, I was trying to tell you." He paused, seemed to gather his courage. "Molly, I know we've known each other only a short time, but I've never felt this way about anyone before. I'm not asking for promises or commitments right now, but I'd like the chance to court you properly, if you're willing." The directness of his declaration was so typically Jake, honest, without artifice, laying his feelings bare without pretense or game playing. Molly found it refreshingly different from the calculated approaches she had received in Philadelphia drawing rooms. "I would like that very much," she replied softly. "I feel the connection between us two, Jake. I can't explain it, but it's there." Relief and joy transformed his features. Emboldened, he reached out to take her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I promise to be patient, Molly. We'll take all the time you need to be sure." The rest of the journey passed in a state of heightened awareness, every glance and casual touch now charged with new meaning and possibility. When they finally arrived back in Placida's late that afternoon, Sarah's surprise at seeing Molly again quickly gave way to delight when they explained the situation. "I knew you were too smart to lock yourself away in that Ortega household," she declared, hugging Molly warmly. "And as for staying here, you're welcome as long as you need, though I suspect my brother has other hopes for your future accommodations." This last was said with a meaningful glance at Jake, who actually blushed beneath his tan. The following weeks unfolded with a rhythm and purpose that filled Molly with growing certainty that she had made the right choice. The town council, upon learning of her qualifications, eagerly offered her the position of teacher for the new school term beginning in September. In the meantime, She assisted Sarah with the boarding house and began preparations for her classes, ordering books and supplies from back east and making plans for how to organize the one-room schoolhouse that was under construction at the edge of town. Jake called at the boarding house regularly, sometimes taking Molly for rides to show her the surrounding countryside, other times simply joining the family for supper and conversation. True to his word, he was patient, never pressing for declarations or commitments beyond what Molly was ready to give. Their courtship progressed naturally, building on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine friendship that had formed during their initial journey. By late July, Molly had become a fixture in Placida's life. The townspeople welcomed her warmly, many offering furniture, books, or other contributions for the new schoolhouse. She had begun informal reading lessons for several children, whose parents were eager for them to get a head start before the official school term began. And her feelings for Jake had deepened into something she could no longer deny was love, a steadier, more certain emotion than the initial attraction that had sparked between them during the storm. It was on a warm August evening that Jake invited her to see his ranch for the first time. Sarah packed them a picnic supper, and they set off in Jake's wagon as the heat of the day began to fade. The 12-mile journey north of Placida's took them through increasingly beautiful country rolling grasslands giving way to piñon and juniper woodlands, with the distant mountains providing a dramatic backdrop. The ranch itself was situated in a sheltered valley with a year-round creek running through it, a priceless asset in this arid land. Jake had named it Nuevo Comienzo, New Beginning, and the appropriateness of the name struck Molly immediately. This was indeed a place where someone could start fresh, building something meaningful from the raw materials of land and hope. The cabin Jake had mentioned was modest but well constructed, with large windows that captured the spectacular views. Behind it stood a barn and corral where several horses gazed curiously at the visitors. Jake gave her a tour of the property with evident pride, showing her the spring that fed the creek, the fertile bottomland where he grew hay for the horses, and the timber he had begun cutting for the planned expansion of the house. They ate their picnic supper on a small rise overlooking the valley, watching as the setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. As darkness fell, Jake built a small fire, and they sat side by side looking up at stars that seemed close enough to touch. "What do you think?" Jake asked finally, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "It's beautiful," Molly replied honestly. "You've created something wonderful here, Jake." He turned to face her, the firelight illuminating his features. "It's still not finished," he said. "The house needs that expansion, the herd could be larger, the fences extended." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What I'm trying to say, Molly, is that this place is just beginning, like our relationship. I've been patient because I wanted you to be sure, to know your own mind without feeling pressured. But I need to tell you now that I love you, and I believe I've loved you since I first saw you standing alone at that abandoned station." The simple declaration, spoken without elaborate rhetoric, but with absolute sincerity, moved Molly more deeply than any flowery speech could have done. In that moment, she recognized the truth she had perhaps known since their night in the line shack, that Jake Newcomb represented not just a man she could love, but a future she could embrace wholeheartedly. "I love you too, Jake," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. "I think I've been falling in love with you from the moment you rode up and said you knew a better destination." Jake's smile in the firelight was radiant. He reached for her hand, then hesitated. "Molly, I want to do this properly. I'm asking for your hand in marriage if you'll have me." "Not right away, we can wait until after the school term starts, until you're settled in your teaching position. But I want you to know that Nuevo Comienzo is meant to be our home, not just mine." Tears pricked at Molly's eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming joy. The stagecoach that had abandoned her had led her not to misfortune but to the greatest blessing of her life. "Yes, Jake Newcomb," she said softly, "I will marry you." He gathered her gently into his arms then, his kiss a tender promise of all the years to come. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnessing this new beginning in a land as old as time. They were married in October of 1872 after the school term was well established and Molly's position in the community secured. The ceremony took place in Placida's small church, with Sarah as matron of honor and Daniel as Jake's best man. The entire town turned out for the celebration afterward, a testament to how quickly Molly had become beloved as their teacher. Following a brief honeymoon in Santa Fe, where Molly deliberately avoided any contact with the Ortega family, they returned to Nuevo Comienzo to begin their life together. The cabin addition was complete, adding 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen to the original structure. Jake had furnished it simply but comfortably, with a few cherished pieces Molly had brought from Philadelphia supplementing the locally made furniture. Life as a rancher's wife and the town's schoolteacher was demanding but deeply satisfying. Molly rode to Placida's each morning to teach, returning to the ranch in the afternoon to help with chores and prepare their evening meal. Jake supported her career wholeheartedly, often discussing her teaching methods and students over supper, taking genuine interest in her professional challenges and triumphs. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Jake's father, was born in the spring of 1874. Molly took a brief respite from teaching but returned to the schoolhouse the following term, often bringing the baby with her. The community embraced this arrangement, with older students delighting in helping care for teacher's little one during lessons. A daughter, Eleanor, joined the family in 1876, followed by another son, William, in 1879. By then, Nuevo Comienzo had expanded considerably. The horse breeding operation had gained regional renown, with Jake's unique crossbreeds becoming sought after throughout the territory. They had added a proper foreman's house and bunkhouse for the 3 ranch hands who now assisted with the larger operation. The schoolhouse in Placida's had grown as well, with Molly now supervising an assistant teacher for the younger children while she focused on the older students. Her innovative teaching methods had attracted attention beyond the small town, with educators from as far as Albuquerque coming to observe her classroom. In the winter of 1882, a letter arrived from Philadelphia that brought news of Molly's former school reopening under new patronage. The headmistress, an old colleague, offered Molly a prestigious position with a salary far exceeding what the small New Mexico town could pay. Jake found her that evening sitting by the fire in their comfortable living room, the letter in her hands, a contemplative expression on her face. "Are you considering it?" he asked quietly, joining her on the settee. Molly looked up at him, taking in the face that had become as familiar and beloved to her as her own reflection. The laugh lines around his eyes deeper now, a touch of silver beginning to appear at his temples, but those striking blue eyes unchanged in their warmth when they rested on her. "Not for a moment," she replied honestly. "I was just thinking about how differently my life might have turned out if that stagecoach hadn't left me behind." Jake smiled, reaching for her hand in a gesture that had become natural over their 10 years together. "I've always been grateful to that dishonest driver," he admitted. "His greed led to my greatest happiness." Molly leaned against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that the better destination Jake had promised that day had indeed been better than anything she could have imagined. Outside, the New Mexico night spread its starry canopy over Nuevo Comienzo, the home that had grown from a simple cabin to a thriving ranch, just as their love had grown from an unexpected meeting to a life rich with purpose, joy, and deep, abiding passion. In the decade that followed, Molly and Jake watched their children grow into capable young people who embodied the best of both parents, Thomas with his father's affinity for horses and the land, Eleanor with her mother's quick intelligence and love of learning, William with a natural artistic talent that had manifested early and continued to develop. The town of Placida's had grown as well, becoming an important stop on the newly constructed railroad line that connected Albuquerque to Santa Fe. The one-room schoolhouse had expanded to a proper school building with separate classrooms for different age groups, and Molly now served as its principal while still teaching the older students. Nuevo Comienzo had prospered beyond Jake's initial dreams. His unique line of horses had gained national recognition, with buyers coming from as far as Kentucky and Virginia to purchase his stock. The original cabin had been incorporated into a sprawling ranch house with a wide veranda that offered spectacular views of the mountains, and the operation now employed a dozen full-time hands. In 1893, as they celebrated their 21st wedding anniversary, Jake surprised Molly with a journey back east, her first return to Philadelphia since she had left as a young woman. They visited her old school, now thriving under her former colleagues' leadership, and Molly gave a well-received lecture on education in the territories to the faculty. Standing in the city where she had once thought her future lay, Molly felt a profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had diverted her path. Philadelphia was, as she remembered, civilized, cultured, familiar, but it no longer felt like home. Home was the wide skies of New Mexico, the ranch that had grown with their love, the community they had helped to build, and most of all, the man who had ridden up when she needed him most and shown her a better destination than she had ever imagined for herself. As they traveled back west, their train passing through landscapes that grew increasingly familiar and beloved, Jake took her hand across the compartment table. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question that needed no elaboration between two people who had shared so much of life together. Molly smiled, thinking of the abandoned trading post where their story had begun, the stagecoach that had left her behind, and the unexpected journey that had led to such profound happiness. "Not a single one," she replied, and the truth of it resonated in her heart like the still, sad music of humanity they had once quoted together beneath the cottonwood trees of their beginning. That evening, as the train carried them ever westward toward home, Molly wrote in her journal a practice she had maintained since her teaching days in Philadelphia. The words flowed easily, a reflection on how the unexpected detours of life often lead to the most beautiful destinations, and how love, when built on a foundation of respect and shared purpose, continues to deepen and flourish through all the seasons of a life well lived. In the years that followed, Nuevo Comienzo remained the center of their world, even as their children began to forge their own paths, Thomas taking an increasingly active role in managing the ranch, Eleanor attending college in Denver before returning to teach alongside her mother, William studying art in Santa Fe under the tutelage of the territory's finest painters. When New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, Jake and Molly attended the celebrations in Santa Fe, both in their 60s but still vibrant and engaged with the life of their community. They had witnessed the transformation of the territory from a rugged frontier to a modern state, had contributed to that transformation through their work and example, and took quiet pride in knowing they had helped shape a better future for the land they loved. Their 40th wedding anniversary in 1912 was marked by a grand celebration at Nuevo Comienzo, with family, friends, and neighbors gathering to honor a love story that had become legendary in Placitas and beyond. 3 generations filled the ranch house and spilled onto the grounds their children, grandchildren, former students, ranch hands who had worked for Jake for decades, and townspeople whose lives had been touched by Molly's dedication to education. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the property, Jake led Molly to the small rise where he had proposed all those years ago. Though both moved more slowly now, their steps measured by time's passage, the connection between them remained as strong as ever. "Did I deliver on my promise?" Jake asked as they stood together, looking out over the ranch that had grown from dream to reality under their care. "Was this truly a better destination than the one you had planned?" Molly turned to him, seeing past the silver hair and lined face to the young cowboy who had appeared when she needed him most. "Beyond anything I could have imagined," she replied, her voice still clear despite the years. "Every day has been a journey worth taking, Jake Newcomb, because I've traveled it with you." In that moment, as they stood together beneath the vast New Mexico sky that had witnessed their beginning, Molly reflected that sometimes the greatest adventures start with a disruption, a stagecoach that leaves you behind, a storm that forces you to seek shelter, a stranger who offers an alternative path. It is in how we respond to these unexpected turns that we discover not just our destination, but our true selves. For Molly and Jake, that response had created not just a life together, but a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone in the ranch that bore the name New Beginning, in the children and grandchildren who carried their values forward, in the community they had helped to build, and in the countless lives touched by their example of what can grow from courage, commitment, and the willingness to follow one's heart toward a better destination.